I'd like to welcome you all to the Massachusetts Historical Society. It's nice to see some new faces, and for those people who are here for the first time, I'd like to extend a special welcome. The Massachusetts Historical Society is an independent nonprofit organization. We have a fabulous collection of manuscripts. We have around 13 million manuscripts in our collection, with a very strong collection related to the American Revolution and the early Republic, which is of course relevant to the program this evening. Our library and our collection is available to the public for free. You can come in and use it whenever you want. We also produce a very active program of schedules and host a variety of exhibitions. We do all of this through the support of our members and donors, so if you are not a supporter of the Mass Historical Society, I hope you'll consider joining. So tonight, this afternoon, we have a program that will look at the phenomenon of the musical Hamilton. The show opened in February of 2015 and has taken the world by storm. It was nominated for 16 Tony Awards and won 11 of them, including Best Musical. It has also won a Grammy Award and a Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Unlike other smash hits, historical dramas such as Les Miserables, it was inspired by an actual biography written by an actual historian. So we thought it would be very appropriate to actually have a bunch of historians to talk about it. Before I get into introducing our speakers this afternoon, let me mention that we had a display in the other room. If any of you, by any chance, happen to miss it, it is a wonderful assortment of material related to Alexander Hamilton that's from our collection. It includes a lock of his hair paired with a lock of George Washington's hair, which is quite unique, as well as what is probably the last letter Hamilton ever wrote. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, I encourage you to take a moment after the exhibition or after the program to look at it. And Peter Drummy, our librarian who put the display together, will be there to answer any questions you may have. So our program this evening has three speakers. Each three of them are contributors to a publication called Historians on Hamilton. We'll have that publication available for sale in the lobby. So after the program, feel free to stop by and pick up a copy if you'd like one. Lera Montero is a professor at Rutgers University. She received her PhD from Brown University and specializes in public humanities, early United States history, and race and ethnic identity. Her work focuses on the use of the past in public culture, with a particular emphasis on issues of race, representation in the telling of the United States past. Joseph Adelman is an assistant professor in the history department at Framingham State University. He's a historian of media communications and politics in the Atlantic world. He is currently at work on two book projects. The first entitled Revolutionary Networks, The Business and Politics of Printing News, 1763 to 1789, and the second has a general history of the post office in America. He earned his bachelor's degree in history from Harvard and his PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Finally, our own president, Catherine Allgor, who is familiar to many of you. Prior to coming to the Mass Historical Society, she was the Director of Education and Volunteers at the Huntington Library, Art Collections and Botanical Gardens in California, and before that was a professor of history at the University of California, Riverside. She received her PhD from Yale University. So just to give you a brief sense of how this program is going to run, we're going to have each of the speakers give a very brief presentation on what their chapter in Historians on Hamilton is about. Then we have a series of 3 questions that each of them will reflect on. And then we'll have a little bit of time for them to have a conversation amongst themselves, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions and answers. So thank you very much, and join me in welcoming our speakers.
Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm usually where Gavin is, so this is a different perspective for me. So the title of my essay begins with a quote from Hamilton: "Remember, I'm your man. Masculinity, marriage, and gender in Hamilton." So I was asked to contribute to this volume because I'm a historian of women's lives and gender. And one of the things I could have done is I could have chosen to tell the stories of Hamilton's women, so the Schuyler sisters, Maria Reynolds. And that is really the primary task, maybe the central task, of a woman's historian, which is to uncover these historical actors and take their lives, their words, their work seriously. So I could have done that, but as they say in Hollywood, I went another way. I decided I'd like to explore a little bit of what the story of the American Revolution would look like from the perspective of an 18th century woman, specifically the central theme of Hamilton the musical, and that is the story of liberty. That the American Revolution was good, that it was revolutionary, and that it resulted in, as Thomas Jefferson sings in Act 2, that we are free. And what he means, and we understand that from our own knowledge and from the musical, it means that he is no longer a subject of the king, oppressed by taxes, with no representation in government. So that's what freedom means for him. Okay, so what's going on, though, with the mothers, sisters, daughters, and wives? Well, at the time of the American Revolution, American women existed under the law of coverture. And if you get nothing else from my presentation, I hope you know this word. And it becomes part of your vocabulary, especially at dinner parties. Coverture, which is out of British law, held that no female person had a legal identity. At birth, a female baby was covered by her father's identity, and when she was married, by her husband's. So the way to think about coverture is the husband and the wife becomes one, but the one is the husband. And as a symbol of this lack of identity, the woman would lose the last name of her father and take the last name of her husband's, becoming a femme couverte in law, covered woman. So what does it mean to not legally exist? Well, of course nobody gets to vote, but that's only part of it. Married women could not make contracts or be sued, so they could not own or work in businesses. Married women, in fact, because they did not legally exist, owned nothing, not even the clothes on their back. They also had no rights to their children, so that if a wife ran away or divorced her husband, she would have no right to her children. But if the husband did that, she had no right to her children as well. And you may say, why is this part of that? And that's because married women also had no rights to their bodies. So that the legal term was the fruits of her body. So that would be her children. That's why she had no rights to them. But also her labor. So her husband could send a wife out and she would generate wages and he could collect those wages. Within marriage, a wife's consent to sex was implied, so that under the law, all sex-related activity, including rape, was legitimate. This total mastery of one human being over another stopped short, but just short of death. So, of course, a man couldn't beat his wife to death, but he could beat her. Now, the law doesn't really reflect real life, and in truth, the practice of coverture on the ground was less restricted than black letter law. So technically a woman could own nothing, but a man who wanted to protect assets for his grandchildren could, using a legal device, sort of basically entail it through his wife and skirting around the son-in-law. And in fact, Philip Schuyler, the father of the Schuyler sisters, did that as well for his. And also the demands of commerce and really just convenient everyday life kind of broke coverture down. So even though women couldn't really work in business or make contracts, they did plenty of business alone or alongside their husbands. And finally, though a husband had the right to marital relations at will in the law, we must assume that there was a lot of negotiation around sex. In fact, coverture is what Abigail Adams was talking about in her famous Remember the Ladies, a letter from 1776, which is right upstairs, just as the Continental Congress was contemplating what an independent America would look like. So contrary to popular opinion, she was not asking John for equal rights or for the vote, but the mitigation of coverture. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. So the American women, literate, middle class, upper class, white, were very aware of the burden of this legal device. And in that moment of 1776, Abigail was not the only one who was thinking something might change, and that's why she's writing that. So let's skip a big bunch of history. I'll just say that before the Revolution and during the Revolution, these women were asked to step up in a variety of ways, and they did. So again, when the Revolution is won, they have every reason to expect that something is different. And here's the big story. It wasn't. Aside from a few loosening divorce laws, for a few, like 15 minutes, you could be a propertied white woman and vote in New Jersey, nothing really changed. So yes, as they sang in the taverns, the world turned upside down. Or as the founders said, the world was made anew, but not for these women. These women entered the shiny, brand new Republican experiment, shackled by the ancient laws of coverture. Well, that sounded rather dramatic, didn't it? And so you think now this time I'm going to wail into the founding fathers for failing to even mitigate this. But I can't judge them because the United States of America has never eliminated coverture. And we can talk about what that means, but it is the reason that women were not regularly on juries until the 1960s. It's the reason that marital rape doesn't become a crime until the 1980s. So, back to Hamilton, the musical, and I have 2 points. So I hope you can see, even in this very brief presentation, that the assumptions, even the basic assumptions that underlie Hamilton, are not uncontested. It's not necessarily the way they see it. And if you came in here and you knew that the American Revolution was not good news for Native Americans, and I think a lot of us know that, and we certainly know it was worse for African Americans, we now know that it kept half of the white population in a form of legal slavery. Okay, so now that we know that, we have to ask ourselves, is it really a revolution? Now, I offer this story, this is my second and final point, because among many of the wonderful things that the musical Hamilton has done for us, it's got the American public interested in stories of the past. And as you're going to hear, I hope, at the end of this panel, there are many stories of the past. And I'd like to think that in this audience is an artist, a young artist who's wondering about what the next hip-hop musical will look like. So I would like to end with a quote from Lin-Manuel. Hip-hop can cover. Lin-Manuel Miranda states, quote, "And I love the idea of telling the stories that you haven't heard before and suddenly making that fair game. Women in the early republic, the game is on." Thank you.
To any of the young artists out there, I think you'll find that our consultation fees are much better than Ron Chernow's. I want to thank Catherine and Gavin and everyone at MHS for inviting me to take part in this. I feel a little awkward not in doing the panel, but I sort of feel like my role in the book when the editors invited me was because I actually have some nice things to say about the musical. And I feel like I'm sort of, I don't know what I am exactly, but the essay that I wrote, which is called Who Tells Your Story? Hamilton as a People's History, is part of a process I've been going through over the past couple of years, and I know lots of others of us as historians, to think about how to capture the energy that's been generated by the musical for people thinking about the founding era. It's true in my classroom, it's true in my house, it's true walking down the street. So where I start in the essay is with a question, which is, what's the obligation of the artist to the past? I think it's fair to say that it's not the same thing as the obligation of the historian. And so clearly there are places in the musical where there are historical inaccuracies, places that Miranda either makes mistakes, or there are places where he makes interpretations that would depart from what most professional historians would say about the era. There are also some places where he very self-consciously takes liberties, where he changes the order of events for dramatic purposes. I don't know if I want to do any spoiler alerts. I don't want to ruin anybody's week. So what we're thinking about, Annette Gordon-Reed described it as historical fiction. It could be described as historical memory. It is not formally a work of history, but I think Miranda's doing, or wanted to pull out that he's doing three things that are interesting for thinking about how artists approach the past. So one is that he's engaged in a project of popularization of history, of telling stories of the past outside of the academy. And that's a process that goes back for the American founding, that goes all the way back practically to the founding. The first formal histories are written in the mid to late 1780s. The example I give in the essay is Parson Weems, who many of you have probably heard of, and if you haven't, you probably know his most famous story, which is about George Washington chopping down a cherry tree when he was 6. So that appears in Weems's very popular biography of George Washington that first appears within a few weeks or months of Washington's death. It's a wildly popular bestseller, and the cherry tree story is this iconic story, right? Washington is 6 years old, and his father discovers this cherry tree, and who did this? How could this happen? And what does Washington say? Weems made the story up. I had one student once tell me that I had ruined her childhood by telling her that. So I hope that has not happened today. He made the story up in his mind. The reason he did it is because he was trying to paint a particular portrait of Washington as deeply honest and moral and as a guidepost for the children of the United States in the first part of the 19th century. He turns Washington into an evangelical Christian with angels circling him at his deathbed. It's this incredibly overwrought. The point with Weems is that it says a lot more about Weems, that particular account. It says a lot about what's going on in the early 1800s with evangelical ministers, with thinking about creating an education process for what it means to be an American, and Washington, through the lax standards of biography in 1800, becomes a vehicle for that. And Miranda is doing a similar project. In one of the essays, I think, Lyra, you quoted it, or it might have been in the Washington Post story a couple days ago, that Hamilton is often seen as being a projection of Obama's America. And Miranda is self-consciously trying to do that, and not in unproblematic ways, and I'll let Lyra handle that part of it, but he really is trying to draw a lesson from the past that works for everybody and is trying to stake a claim about the American past for how it relates to the present. Though I think he's not completely fabricating things the way that Parson Weems did. I don't want to make that claim. The second thing I would say is that even in his interpretive leaps, his interpretive imagination, as artistry goes about the American founding, he is incredibly attentive to the past and to the history. And that is things that are most obvious. There is half of a number of a smash Broadway musical in which two men are quoting verbatim from George Washington's farewell address. Many of the other numbers, and I talk about a few of these, are pulling, if not direct quotes, because Hamilton, for all his talents, did not write very much in meter, but is pulling things from the primary sources. He went and read all of the letters that Burr and Hamilton sent back and forth in June and July of 1804 that led to the meeting at Weehawken. And then he adds a twist, an insight, something actually that most historians would not do, where he sets that particular "your obedient servant" towards the end of the second act, where they're sending their letters back and forth. It's obviously set to music. It's set to a waltz. It's a rap waltz, which is this, right? It's an intricate dance that they're circling around each other, and the stage is a turntable, so they're literally circling around each other, and manages then in that same number to capture some of, it's not really the ridiculousness, but it's a sort of stiff formality of 18th century correspondence. They go pages and pages, ripping each other to shreds in formal language, and then you get to the end, "Your obedient servant," right? And the harpsichord plays, and everything gets all formal, and everything's fine. And he captures something, I don't know if I've figured out a way to capture something like that in writing, to say to an audience, this is what 18th century correspondence was like. It was like this. They rip each other to shreds, and then, well, they bow, and the harpsichord plays, and "your obedient servant." The third is that in his attentiveness to the past, he is, more than a lot of artists, attentive to the incompleteness of our stories. And there are several numbers in the piece where he is very conscious that he is telling a story about the past rather than the story about the past. My favorite example of this is in the first act, where he dramatizes the courtship of Alexander and Eliza in a very sort of beautiful romantic number. They meet, they fall in love. She's nervous because he's asking her father for permission to marry, and then they kiss. End of scene. And the next scene is at the wedding, and Angelica, her sister, is giving a toast, and then they rewind. I mean, literally the chorus is saying, rewind, 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 and the turntable is turning, and you go back to the beginning of the story of where they meet, and you hear the whole story again from Angelica's perspective. And what was this sort of sappy, romantic, schmaltzy Broadway number becomes this story of tragic loss and missed opportunity. And there's some questions we could ask about the history, but simply by setting those two numbers side by side, playing the courtship over twice over, once from a sort of standard Broadway perspective, it's told by Eliza, but it's sort of omniscient in its presentation, and then rewinding and saying, but wait, let's watch the same thing, but let's hear Angelica's comments from the side, watching the two of them meet, watching the two of them fall in love, coming back, and the whole thing looks different by the time you get back to the end of the number where she's back standing up with her toast. So, spoiler alert, they get married. Which one is the right story? And Miranda doesn't really say, to his credit, and that's part of the point, is that it's not, we don't know, and we have to think about that. And we could talk in the comments about any of the other numbers. So I think what I'm trying to get at in the essay and in talking through it a little bit here, one is that, just to say, Miranda's better than most popular chroniclers we've had. I'm definitely not thinking of a Mel Gibson movie right now. And I want historians to engage critically with the work, to think about it, and Catherine and Lyra both do that quite masterfully in the book. And find a way to, I mean, people are really, my 4-year-old is asking about the American founding. And I want to find a way, she asked about Mariah Reynolds the other day, and that was not good. To finish that story, my 9-year-old said, we'll tell you when you're older. Whew. But I want to capture that. I want to capture the students of mine who sort of sit slouched, and then I put on a Hamilton song. I'm like, oh, he knows Hamilton. He plays that in class. That's interesting. I want us to find a way to capture that, while at the same time maintaining a critical eye, maintaining some perspective on the things that that the show does well or not as well in terms of thinking about the past. But to really do that in a critical way, and to think about that from the perspective of what artists can and should try to do.
I'm Lera Montero, and I am really delighted to be invited to be part of this welcome committee, I guess, for Hamilton coming to Boston from the Massachusetts Historical Society. And I've been writing and speaking publicly about this show since 2015, which is kind of amazing to me, I have to say. The staying power of this phenomenon continues to surprise me. So, and that's relevant in particular because the essay of mine that is in Historians on Hamilton in the book actually reflects my very earliest thinking on the show. I was fortunate enough to see Hamilton the week it opened on Broadway, and even though I literally turned to my companion just as the lights were going down and whispered, "I'm pretty sure I'm gonna hate this," I was, of course, enraptured from the very first moments. And, but along with being an avid theater goer, I'm also a scholar of the politics of the past, and by which I mean that I study why we tell which stories about the past, in what contexts, and what those stories mean. A lot of course, what Joe was just getting at as well. And from that perspective, there are several features of the show that really called out for analysis and exploration. Hence, what became a chapter in Historians on Hamilton began life as an article in the academic journal The Public Historian, which I wrote right after I saw the show. So in September of 2015, wrote it, submitted it. And it's been really delightful and fascinating to watch the proliferation of other work by scholars from a range of disciplines that has been published since that time. And Historians on Hamilton, of course, includes work by a lot of people who aren't necessarily historians, who work on, in various, well, perhaps in theater history, but other areas of performance studies as well. And actually on the train right up here, I got the chance to catch up with a really great article just published by an English professor at Bucknell Elena Machado Saez, in which she engages in this really fascinating close reading that compares the way, or rather excavates the ways in which Miranda's first Broadway hit, In the Heights, now I think so overshadowed that many people have forgotten it ever existed or never heard of it to begin with, and Hamilton, and which many scholars who have studied Hamilton, including myself, have tended to draw a contrast between the two shows, and this article actually draws out many of the ways in which there actually deal with a lot of very similar themes and reflect a lot of very similar investments, particularly in a concept of the American dream defined by property ownership, by the exclusion of blackness, and also really reflecting Miranda's interest and investment in affiliation with a predominantly white middle-class Broadway audience. But enough about all that other exciting new scholarship. I'm going to go back a little bit to my original article, which is titled Race-Conscious Casting and the Erasure of the Black Past in Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. And this piece was originally is primarily concerned with how, underneath all of the subversive artistic choices, the musical promotes what some public historians have called the exclusive past. That is to say, a past in which the only people who did anything of importance were wealthy white men, and a past that therefore belongs more to white men than to anyone else. Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton does nothing to challenge this understanding of the past. In fact, it kind of does the opposite. And it's easy to miss the fact that there is not a single black character in the show because there are so many black and brown bodies on the stage. A lot of discussion surrounding the play, including by black cast members, suggest that the play is generous in allowing black and brown people to identify with a history that on some level isn't really theirs, presumably because their ancestors weren't a part of it. One of the early taglines used to promote the musical, for example, ran, quote, "This is the story of America then, told by America now," right, which was very much this kind of rousing Obama's America kind of idea that it was tapping into. But as I argued in that original article, and as Leslie Harris elaborates in much greater detail in her chapter in Historians on Hamilton, America then did look like the people in this play, in large part. New York City, where most of the play takes place, for example, was 14% black during the Revolutionary era, and there were slaves in nearly every wealthy household. This means that every scene in the play contained an opportunity for a black or enslaved character to appear. One of the most egregious omissions is the song "The Room Where It Happened," where Aaron Burr says that Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton were alone at dinner, and sings that, quote, "No one else was in the room where it happened," thus completely erasing the slaves that certainly would have been in that room serving dinner. Similarly, the musical erases the role of the thousands of black soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War, including a man named Cato, who was enslaved by Hercules Mulligan, one of the main characters in the first act of Hamilton, and who actually performed some of the acts of spying on the British that Mulligan takes credit for in the musical. Not to mention that the financial system that is described as a work of genius that was created by Alexander Hamilton was built on the bodies and labor of enslaved people of color. The effect of this whitewashed account of the past is to reinforce the idea that white Americans do have more of a right to the legacy of the revolution than do people of color, as limited as that revolution may have been, in fact. The irony of employing black and brown bodies, talents, and music and dance forms to glorify the white past becomes even more painful when we consider that the ancestors of the actors who portray the founders were explicitly excluded from the freedoms for which the founders fought. I believe that telling white history in a way that encourages people of color to feel closer to it only makes it harder for us to see the inequalities that shape our lives, inequalities that can be directly traced to the choices of the founding fathers. In my chapter, I suggest a comparison between Miranda's choice to write a musical about this story and the enthusiasm of people of color to claim the founder's history as their own via the musical, with the Clark-Stall test, which were pivotal evidence in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Just as black children in the 1940s revealed a strong preference for white dolls over black dolls and called the white dolls nice and pretty and the black dolls ugly and bad, does Hamilton express and encourage a similar preference and even reverence among people of color for white history? For me, the stakes of this question are raised by the program of the Rockefeller Foundation, the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and the New York City Department of Education to bring 20,000 public school students, the vast majority of whom are black and brown, to see the musical. I don't know if a similar thing is happening here in Boston at all, but I imagine, you know. So if the goal is to make them excited about theater and music and live performance, that's wonderful. I'm a huge fan of theater, and Hamilton is undoubtedly a really great example of that art form and will inspire, you know, that future person either in this audience or in one of those Hamilton audiences, you know, to create some great show in the future, just as, you know, Lin-Manuel Miranda famously describes how inspirational Rent was for him in his creative development as a teenager. But the rhetoric surrounding the show doesn't tend to be about, this is a great work of theater, let's go see it because it's a great work of theater, right? Children need to see it because it's a great work of theater. Instead, that rhetoric tends to really focus on implying that what is powerful about the musical is how it brings history to life, which prompts me to ask, is this the history that we most want black and brown youth to connect with? One in which, as I said originally in that article, black lives so clearly do not matter. I'll conclude my brief summary of my piece by saying that I see my role as a public historian, as a cultural critic, as being to highlight the unnoticed and often unintentional messages contained in popular stories about the past, and to point out what those stories imply about who we aspire to be. Hamilton is a brilliant, witty, musically complex hagiography of a group of white men who deliberately founded this country on principles of white supremacy, creating a legacy of anti-blackness that continues to plague us today. We should not overlook the implications of this, even as we sing along to its songs.
So we circulated among us a set of questions that we thought might be interesting to get us started. And Gavin, how long should we take for these questions? Yeah, actually, why don't we pick our? I'm going to let you pick a favorite. Why don't we do one question, all three of us, and then we can open it up to the folks. Want to pick your favorite?
Like each of us pick one favorite?
No, let's do one question if we only have that we all can do.
I mean, I love that one.
Okay, yeah, there we go. This was a
say
great one, and Gavin, this was your masterstroke. What essay would you like to see written that you haven't seen yet? So we have a whole book of essays. What would we like to see? This could be a new analysis, or it could be something in the future that looks at the impacts of the play. So imagine your dream essay.
Oh, I get to start?
Yeah.
Well, so my dream essay is actually the dream essay that I started imagining existing during intermission. You know, having gone into the show thinking, oh my God, I might hate this. And then during intermission, I was like, oh, I can't wait to read the essay about. And to my knowledge, it has still not been written. And that is an essay by somebody who is so I brought to bear in my essay the things that I felt like I had, you know, the scholarly and you know, the kind of background and facility to be able to address, right? There's one element there that I think is so crucial and hasn't been addressed enough, really in any of the scholarship that I read, which is the choreography.
Oh, yeah.
Because the choreography, and you know, for most of America that loves Hamilton, loves it based on the music, right? but the choreography is amazing, right? I'm a dancer, but I'm not a dance scholar, so that I don't have, quite like the theoretical, knowledge and background and ability to really like name exactly how that vocabulary is integrated and what's how that then interfaces with the music and interfaces with the story and and the costumes and the characters and all of these things. But basically, like I am waiting for like the full, analysis artistically on all levels, but especially incorporating and addressing the choreography.
And what did you see in the choreography that, was there something in particular?
Yeah, so it's been 3 years.
But it's burned in your brain.
But it is of course burned into my brain, and I really should just break down and like get one of those bootleg copies. It's kind of strange that I haven't, but what stood out to me is frankly very similar to what stood out to me in the Heights, which is just this fusion of a lot of different dance styles, and references to a lot of different dance styles that is that is different from what you would normally see on Broadway, or rather includes what you would normally see on Broadway, but also incorporates a lot of other dance styles into it. And it was just like it was one of those things where I was just like like if you taste a flavor sometimes and you just cannot explain what it is, but you're just like, oh my God, that was amazing, right? And maybe if you stop and slow down, you can break it down, right? But that's kind of, for me, because I aspire to be a dance scholar, but I am not yet there. Like for me, that's kind of was my experience with it, was like, what is happening here in terms of the choreography, in terms of the movement that is happening on stage is amazing. The other thing that I want to see more about is gender within, in terms of like contemporary gender analyses, the choices around, the portrayal of, the main figures, of course, all of whom are, or most of whom are men, but also the chorus.
I think that chorus inspired, it's so great. I mean, the discussion of whether there should be a Tony Award category for choruses, because I think, and they do so much work. Can I my answer, I think, flows from that. So, some of the fun parts of Hamilton is where something modern intrudes. So, suddenly they'll turn around and say, immigrants, we get the job done. Applause line, and there's a really funny moment where they're talking about the ladies, and the guys are like, hey, and it's really funny. But one kind of streak of where the modernity strikes to me such a discordant note to what I know to be true is this casual assumption of premarital, and even marital, but premarital sex. So there's a lot of stuff like, I'm good with the ladies, I'm a tomcat, let's strip down to our socks. And there's no real understanding that for women of all classes, premarital sex was an incredibly risky and dangerous business. And again, you could be a Schuyler sister, but if you end up pregnant, everybody was pretty much doomed to a life on the street as a prostitute. That's danger. And even within marriage, so marital sex, every time a woman engaged in sex, she chanced pregnancy, and she took her life in her hands. So the article that I would like to see would be written by a quantitative historian, like the driest historians ever, where they look at constructed danger, which would be duels and war, versus real danger, which is sexuality outside of marriage and pregnancy. And we need a quantitative historian because I'm going to bet, she said, that the chances of a white man dying on the battlefield, especially from actual fighting, was nothing compared to a woman on her fifth or sixth child. That's what I would see.
Okay, well, those are way cooler than anything I would say. But that's not going to stop me from answering. The thing I'd be interested in seeing, so I will confess, #humble brag, that I've seen the show twice. But this is where the essay comes. It gets back to a real point. I'm not just bragging. saw it with the original cast and then saw it in Chicago. And so this past summer, it has now metastasized and multiplied into a lot of different casts. The cast in Chicago, we saw an understudy, but the lead for Burr is an Asian American man instead of an African American man. There's a London cast where they're talking about how much they hate George III with very solid British accents. There are now variable audiences who may or may not, I mean, I think I got the jokes about, I grew up in New York, so I think I got some of the jokes about New Jersey more than some of the other people in the audience in Chicago. But even on that level, the audiences are now a wide variety of audiences, and the casting has expanded out. What struck both my wife and me in Chicago was that Hamilton was played by an African-American man, and so a line like "Immigrants, we get the job done," the valence was just a little different than hearing it from Miranda, who you sort of, right, you're
He isn't it?
his family is first generation immigrant, and I didn't know the man's past from who played Hamilton in Chicago. And Puerto Ricans as immigrants, right? There's all right, but there are Asian American actors playing these parts, and not simply people of African American or Latino backgrounds. And so somebody who could play with, you're probably the person to do it, who could think about the variety of casting, about the variety of audiences. I mean, this is going to go further than England. At some point, it'll go in various other places. What's it going to mean to have a Puerto Rican man standing at a theater in Beijing saying but seriously, right? That's not unlikely to happen at some point if it's not already planned. That would be something I think would be after we do the quantitative history.
So we still have some time. Do we have questions and answers? And we ask you to stand up and make yourself heard so you, again, can be... yes, Mr. Madison. Now, you get one question. I've read your stuff. I know you can go on and on.
So, you brought up something which is very relevant to me. The reason I'm Madison is because I actually teach high school history at different places. I go in a costume and teach a 90-minute class. And while I'm doing this, I start off by talking about the issues, and then I bring the students up. And we did little skits, little vignettes together. The students get to play the parts of Patrick Henry and George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and Dolly Madison, etc. And so I am looking at the same question that you're looking at. In 90 minutes, I'm limited. But MIT is offering me a 5-week course. They do special high school courses, and I want to bring in other characters. I can write the parts for Dolly Madison and et cetera because they're well known, but the only people that I can think of that I could include would be my valet, Paul Jennings, who wrote a history when he was about 65, and the Hemmings. My namesake, James Madison Hemmings, wrote a short letter talking about, of course, his James and Sally in France and all of that. And my thought is, can I bring them in? How can I get the students to be able to somehow bring those characters out? So that would be my question. Do you have advice for me?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is Margaret Minardi's books, Making Slavery History, and particularly in the context of, doing this in Cambridge or in the Boston area, that looks, the early chapters of which are entirely about basically the various black people who were, and actually some of Native American descent, who were involved in the Revolutionary War and the process by which they were written out of the story. And then later the process by which they get written or brought back in as part of various movements in the 19th century. But I would definitely recommend checking out some of the early chapters of that book for some of those figures. I mean, not only Crispus Attucks, of course, but also other people who were involved in the war. And I mean, I love, for me, like local is like, site-specific stuff is always where I go first. So that was the first thing that comes to mind for me.
So I love that you asked that question, and I understand that, and that's part of what we do is try to uncover these stories. So without giving you my 45-minute lecture on the importance of the Scottish Enlightenment to the American Revolution, let me just say that the founders loved the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment, and when you look at that, you realize sort of why. One of the central tenets was law doesn't matter as much as what they called manners. And what they meant by that was what we call culture, but it was ways of treating each other. It wasn't just, teaspoons. It was ways of treating each other, ways of interacting, bonds of civility, though that's a terrible word now. And so, of course, that was very appealing to the founders because they were about to put in place a bunch of laws that they were not sure was even going to work. So what was going to hold us together? And the answer was going to be this idea of manners. And so they went to the women of their generation, and this is Anne Willing Bingham, this is Angela Schuyler Church, Margaret Bayard Smith, Mercy Otis Warren, speaking of local, Abigail Adams, Dolly Madison, and they said, look, you have a really important role to play in this experiment. If the law goes to hell, you can bring things together with conversation, with politeness, with what we call building a culture. And so these women took that job very seriously. And I'm thinking of Anne Willing Bingham building a salon culture in Princeton, New Jersey. And Dolly Madison, and others of her ilk who answered the lack of political structure in the federal government by building a social structure, I call it the unofficial sphere, where political business could get done, and helped the young republic limp along, really, until they decided it was going to be a democracy with 2 states and a powerful president. So there are women there, at the risk of, obviously looking like I'm trying to sell books, parlor politics, in which the ladies of Washington helped build a city and a government. They're out there. That's a great thing I would say, is you think they're not there, all those people are there. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. We can pass it to you.
Thanks. Okay, so I haven't seen Hamilton yet. I'm going to see it this week. But can you tell me a little bit more about how you think it reflects Obama's America?
Okay.
Well, I mean, I can give my sort of jaded view in the last year or so is that it reflects a sort of naive view that we've overcome racism.
I think you're right. I think you're very right about that, right? Like, I mean, so, I mean, one of the things that also doesn't get talked about a whole lot in, the scholarship on Hamilton is that, there is a kind of pseudo-minstrelsy aspect to having a bunch of black and brown people up on stage, engaging in certain stereotypical kinds of performances of blackness in particular, for a largely white audience, right? And the idea that, oh yeah, exactly, yeah, back in the Obama America, we don't have racism anymore. All those people in the audience, we know they voted for Obama, right? And therefore it's okay to now, like have this kind of portrayal and have this kind of dynamic happening between the audience and the people on stage. And one of the things actually as far related to that I thought was just really this moment that kind of happened. I mainly saw it on Twitter. I don't know if it extended off of Twitter, but in the first few months of Hamilton being open, it became, well, frankly, this was not a surprise, but it became public that the cast members of Hamilton were being paid what cast members of Broadway shows are paid, which isn't a whole hell of a lot. I mean, it's relatively a lot, they get paid on a weekly basis, and it's relatively a lot if you imagine that you're always getting paid that on a weekly basis, but actors do not work every week. The ones in Hamilton do now, but frankly, they'd been so involved in creating the show too, that they ended up launching this campaign largely on Twitter and getting the right to some of the, a share of the actual profits of the show, which is pretty amazing. The original cast, I doubt that is extended past the original cast, but still, because they did co-create it. But anyway, one of the things that for me that highlights is just the idea of like how, even the amount that they were getting paid on a weekly basis was what people were paying to come and watch the show in a single night, and that also for me was like, yeah, you know, this is, the naivete of not only the racial stuff with Obama's America, but also, you know, how very, the economic disparities that still are very, very dramatically in place. I mean, but also, you know, the connection was also very much cultivated by Obama. Like, he wanted that connection, right? I don't think he knew about the initial, I think he was expecting something, you know, more along the lines of In the Heights, because that's what was still playing on Broadway when he invited Miranda to come to the White House the first time. But he definitely cultivated the idea that this is kind of like, you know, that Hamilton is to Obama as Camelot is to JFK. You know, like that was definitely.
Yeah, and I want to say too, it's like for all the original thoughts here, and there have been plenty of them, that one was absolutely constructed because, and it started with Miranda talking about himself. It became Miranda is Hamilton because immigrant, you know, coming in from the bottom, and then Obama got folded into it, and so it became very much this idea of America, in spite of the fact that, as many historians have pointed out, you know, Hamilton hated like the unwashed masses and was an elitist, but you know, it becomes that. So I think that was very self-conscious.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he had no way.
I think we have another question there. And we will deliver the mic to you. Oh, there we go.
So I haven't seen the musical yet, but I listened to the soundtrack. And one of the things, having read the book that it's based on, kind of troubled me was in the opening of the musical, how they portray Hamilton's mother and the kind of the negative things that they say about her and how Hamilton, you know, came to be born and that. So I was just wondering if you had any comments on that.
You know, I think so. I think what they're doing though is they're reflecting how the people of the time would have understood Hamilton's mother. I've forgotten her name. Terrible. But anyway, she formed a liaison, an extramarital liaison with a man, and then bore a child, which of course puts her out of the pale, you know, of. And she was in essence, she wasn't a prostitute, but that would be the next step. So had she had a daughter. And when you're talking about that opening, what did sort of annoy me is this idea, like, you know, he had nothing. He was white and male and literate and healthy. And I know it was tough for him, but I always think of that essay about what if Shakespeare had a sister. Well, had Hamilton had a sister from that mother, who that the men of her culture would call a whore, and would call whatever else, but basically that she's a whore, that it's a prostitute, that he's a bastard, what would have happened to Hamilton's sister? And the answer would be she would have been a prostitute. And if she'd been very, very, very lucky because it was Caribbean nation and she was white, she might have ended up as a planter's wife in a very tough environment. So, the harsh words that they were using about that woman, I think, are absolutely period specific. They would have understood her to be a whore.
And I think they're actually based on, or at least something that was was rumored to have said about him.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
Peter.
So, yeah.
Peter, I'm checking with Peter. That's right. Yes. Yeah.
I think many people.
I'm not going to make you quote anything, Peter. I think we have time for one more question or thought. How many people have seen Hamilton? Oh, good. Wow, that's good. Good. In London. Oh, really? And how was it? Oh, I'm sorry, there's a question in the back. Yeah.
So, as a lifelong organizer, progressive educator, I have always been torn between the need to portray our institutions as perpetually hierarchical and constantly rejuvenating and finding new ways to oppress under new circumstances. It's the genius of capitalism. It's able to do that phenomenally well. And the countervailing need to help people realize that there's more hope than that story portrays. So the fact that Hamilton portrays or implicitly says these truths, these values are as legitimate for you, black cast owners, cast members, and youth in the audience, as they were for these white plantation owners, is an incredibly powerful message. And I was wondering how you all, as historians, play that out in terms of the lessons you're trying to give to the public, that we want to be truthful about the oppressive and continually reinvention of exploitation in this country, without denying that the values of dignity and democracy and opportunity are worth claiming for all of us.
I think you say that, right? So what you're doing with your students is you're trying to make them smart, good, critical thinkers. And they got to know that the system, whatever it is, and whoever they are, pretty much is stacked against them. But as long as they know that, they can fight, and that they can hope, because they know if you can get them to see as it truly is, that's the first step to changing it. It's only when you think everything's fair and nice or wonderful, you can't change anything. Why would you want to change anything? So I think you did a great job, so. And on that note of hope, I want to thank my fellow panelists. I want to thank Chris for keeping us lit and alive, and thank you, Gavin, for setting it up, and thank you all for coming out on a beautiful Saturday.